This is Dr. Burnett. This short lecture video is going to go over the Public Health Finance Module 5 chapter and the associated assignment. Now, we've already seen a fair amount of this content in the text chapter 9, so I'll just hit the highlights here. That said, it's worth at least reading through this chapter because it gives you a pretty good feel for what things are like in public agencies. And there's a distinct difference between how those operate, even financially, and how for-profits operate. Now, looking at some of the questions for the assignment, you can see right there, these two questions: who are the users of financial statements? Well, it actually says it right up here. These are basically, the expression is anybody with a financial interest and or stakeholders. Another one, and I'm not quite sure if I see it here or not, would be regulators as well. People who do regulation, like government agencies and so forth. One way to think about this is to think of your own experience with your credit rating. Who has a good reason to peek in at that credit rating? These would be people who have a financial interest in you. So let's say if somebody's going to give you a credit card, at this point in time, now they have an interest in your financial well-being. So they would reasonably look at your credit report. And other times people look at your credit report is when people are going to enter into longish-term relationships, quote-unquote relationships with you. That might be if you're going for a car lease or a home loan or even just an apartment. The other people want to know that you'll be able to make your payments. So that goes there into the financial interest thing. So the same is true of companies. Anybody who's going to do business with you or loan you money has an interest in finding out if you're going to be around. When I worked in insurance companies, one of the other concerns, especially for state regulators, was whether or not we had adequate reserves. In other words, do we have enough money in the bank to cover the expected claims, that is, bills from hospitals and doctors, that we'll have to pay soon. Now, looking at the internal people within a company, it's also, the financial statements are extremely helpful to them as well. It helps to measure their own progress. In other words, if the company has profit targets, or if a division or multiple divisions are trying to compete for company resources, the company will want to know which departments are most profitable and which ones seem to be just losing money constantly. The reason being is at the time when companies decide how to allocate their capital resources, which is a fancy way of saying we've got so much money in the bank to reinvest in ourselves, but we're not just going to do it at random, but we're going to make sure that we give it to the departments where we expect to see most of that back. It's like any investment. So in that regard, the financial statements are useful inside the company as well. So it's not just inside, it's also outside. Now, this harks back to one of the other chapters that we've already seen. There's a bunch of different agencies involved in the game of making sure that your financial statements are trustworthy and accurate. A lot of it starts with the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission. Then you're going to see FASB right here, Financial Accounting Standards Board. There's also a GASB for government, the government version of the same thing, because government financial statements look a little different than regular business financial statements. CPAs, their institute, also play a large role in setting standards for what financial statements should look like. And lastly, all three of these bodies deal with what they call generally accepted accounting principles. These are just the basic ways of doing your financial statements. There's a lot, as I've mentioned in other chapters, like practice protocols for physicians. In other words, this is just how most people do it. And if you do it this way, then everyone kind of knows what to expect. And lastly, once you do all these financial statements, if you've done everything according to your standards up here and your GAAP standards there, if you've done all that, an auditor, you should have an auditor no matter what, but the auditor will come in. Auditor is just somebody who knows finance, an accountant or a finance person, and they'll look at your financial statements objectively. They're not an employee of yours, so they're paid for their honest opinion. So they'll look at your financial statements and then they'll write a letter saying whether or not you should trust those financial statements. So anytime you actually see a company or an organization's financial statements, you'll see in front of those a note from an auditor saying that they looked at them and they look good. And the reason for that, well, as I've kind of already hinted, is you want an outside opinion to say that no one's lying to you on these financial statements. Now, looking at the other questions associated with this chapter, the why is pretty straightforward. The most important reason to follow standards is so that you can compare one company to another. In healthcare, you can think of this as there's standard ways of presenting patient lab results or vital signs. That way, anybody who looks at it, doctor, nurse, a doctor from another hospital, it's always kind of presented the same way, so it's easy to compare. One of the other nice things is because it's always collected in the same way or presented in the same way, people know how to quote-unquote read it. Even if there are weaknesses or there are things you can't quite see that you really want to see, if everyone does things in the same way, it's a little bit like census data. Even if it's not perfect, if it's standard and consistent, people have developed workarounds that they do trust. Thus the need for consistency and those standards that we just mentioned. Speaking of all those standards, what entities are involved in regulating? That's all the GAAP and the FASB and the GASB. That's all those people we just went through. GAAP, we already know from above, that's your accounting principles, which is just kind of like a protocol. And as I just mentioned, what's the purpose of an auditor's opinion? That's just to kind of say, oh, okay, I double checked, I looked over their shoulder at their financial statements, and I agree that those look clean and accurate. In healthcare terms, you might think of an auditor as a second opinion. In other words, someone else who looks at the patient or looks at the patient chart and says whether or not they agree with the first surgeon's opinion. And to give you an example that I hope you never experience, in one of my old companies, I was in charge of setting the value for physician practices. And most of the times we were doing that because hospitals or insurance companies or networks were buying the practice. So that's kind of a good reason. But sometimes it was a divorce. And that's where the doctor would claim that their practice is not worth anything, so you can have half of nothing. But the spouse, the other one who's not the doctor, would claim that the practice is worth millions of dollars and that they deserve half of that. So that was kind of my role in certain situations where I would come in and I was kind of playing the role of auditor by looking at the financial statements and trying to put a value on the practice.